All right, well, we've still got some people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Can all the panelists hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Audrey Mossberger, and I'm the Director of Events at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event on recalibrating geopolitical relations in the Indo-Pacific. We have an expert lineup of speakers today, whom I know everyone is anxious to hear from, and so I won't take up too much time here. Now, following our 4:45 p.m. panel, we'll open it up to a moderated audience Q&A. For those joining us here on WebEx, you are welcome to submit a question using the Q&A feature, the icon for which is located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can also email questions to events@nbr.org, which is what we encourage you to do if you are joining us today via live stream. Feel free to send your questions in anytime prior to Q&A, as you might find that they are addressed during the discussion. If not, our moderator will do his best to present all questions to our panel within our allotted time. Finally, the video recording of today's event will be available on our website at nbr.org shortly after the event. Well, we look forward to a very lively and informative discussion today. And with that, I'll turn it over to NBR's Executive Vice President, Michael Wills. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you to all of our panelists and all of our audience members for joining us today. Looking forward to a fascinating discussion. I'm going to just say a couple of remarks at the outset. This event derives in large part from NBR's Strategic Asia program, which for 20 years has been looking at strategic dynamics across the Asia-Pacific region and trying to understand relative shifts in the balance of power and the implications for governments, and particularly for the US government as Washington tries to exercise its interests in the region. And in the last few years, the intensification of that competition has really sharpened, and we've seen obviously a deepening US-China competition growing. We've seen significant impacts of pushback against globalization and free trade. And in the last 18 months or so, the impacts of a global pandemic that's really sort of forced a lot of questions on governments around the region. And so today we're going to discuss these issues in two parts, first with Ashley Tellis and then with our group of expert panelists. And so let me introduce Ashley briefly right now. His day job is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington, D.C. He also holds the Tata Chair for Strategic Affairs at the Carnegie Endowment. I've had the great pleasure of working with Ashley since 2000 in the very first Strategic Asia volume, and with him since 2004 as research director for our Strategic Asia program. And so it's a pleasure for me to turn this over to him now and ask him to describe some of his thoughts as we look out at this tumultuous world across the Indo-Pacific and what this means for US strategic interests. Ashley.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here back at an NBR event, and of course to interact with all the participants in this discussion virtually. As you mentioned, we've been trying through the Strategic Asia program to keep track of the various changes that have been occurring in the broad geopolitical landscape in Asia. And as one looks particularly at the last 4 or 5 years or so, I think the characterization that this is an age of tumult is quite an accurate one. To my mind, there have been 3 interacting variables that are present today, but have had their roots in the events of the last few years. The first is, of course, the reality of deepening US-China competition. My own view was that this competition was a long time coming. And certainly during the second term of the Obama administration, it became quite apparent that President Obama's efforts to diffuse this competition by reaching out to China and trying to develop new terms of engagement had, for all practical purposes, failed. For those of us who have sort of looked even further back, it became obvious, certainly after the 2008 financial crisis, that China was looking at its role in the world in very new ways. in ways that would complicate American interests and potentially change the character of the global political order. If you take an even longer view, as Rush Doshi has done in his recent book, it's become quite obvious that in many ways the turning point in China's re-entry into the world really goes back to the foundation of the People's Republic itself. And so, as we have pointed out in different past volumes of Strategic Asia, China went through first that revolutionary phase, then a phase of rebuilding under Deng. And certainly since Hu Jintao has become more and more confident in its ability to shape the world rather than being shaped by the world. I think the United States was slow to see these changes taking place in China. And even if we perceived these changes, I think at least two administrations took the view that we ought not to do anything to force a confrontation, and therefore ended up, treating China with, I think, more optimism than was perhaps warranted. Certainly, this came to a head during the Trump administration, which finally decided to speak clearly about the realities of great power competition, the return of great power competition, and take cudgels to China. Unfortunately, the United States spent 4 years prosecuting a competition with China in a somewhat incoherent way. President Trump, I think, identified China's economic practices as being central to the competition. He also recognized that China's military modernization had become a very serious threat. But I don't think he developed an effective enough strategy to deal with both these challenges. The United States continued to stay out of the integration efforts, the economic integration efforts that were taking place in Asia. And even though President Trump advertised a robust US military investment response to Chinese military modernization, he certainly was not able to, to put that process on the rails by the time he left office. Now we see the Biden administration in office and in many fundamental ways continuing what President Trump began, which is accepting the proposition that US-China competition is serious and that it is here to stay. However, I would make the point that we are still in an early phase in this competition. And even the Biden administration, for all its resolution in attempting to cope with China, has not yet developed a strategy that, one, has been appreciated by the American people, and two, that has given enough space for our friends and allies to play a clear role in. I think this is still very much a work in progress, and one can only hope that by the end of summer, when the administration unveils its Indo-Pacific strategy, there will be some clarity about the direction in which the administration wants to take the United States in this coming competition with China. So I would make the point that of all the elements that have contributed to the tumult of the last several years, the most fundamental element has been this shift, both in Washington and in Beijing, about their perceptions of the other, and the recognition in both capitals that they're going to have to deal with the other as a rival for a very, very long time to come. So what does this actually mean in practice? I think the one thing we can quite confidently say is that it won't be a return to the old Cold War that we knew. And that is simply because the realities of economic interdependence will continue to bind both sides in very substantial and in very meaningful ways. The Biden administration has offered, at least in the writings of some of the senior officials who have come into office has offered the proposition that US-China competition will be defined by competitive coexistence. But the details of what that entails, as I said, are still unclear. So if I were to hazard a guess, I would think of competitive coexistence as essentially taking the form of a triangle, with military rivalry and technology rivalry at the base of that triangle, and ideological rivalry at the superstructure. So there will be some elements of ideological rivalry, and to that degree, there may be some similarities with that of the Cold War. President Biden himself has on several occasions talked about the struggle between democratic regimes and autocratic regimes, and so on and so forth. And it's very clear that the Chinese government, and certainly the Communist Party of China, does want to puncture the claims of liberalism that liberalism has to universalism. And to the degree that the Chinese state pushes this ideological fight against liberalism, I think the ideological dimensions of the struggle may become more prominent. But I don't think we should exaggerate them, because at the end of the day, this will not be a titanic struggle between democracy and autocracy, even though there may be some elements of that. At the end of the day, this is a geopolitical contest, and it's really about power. It's about influence. It's about the capacity to reorder the global system in ways that are sympathetic to the interests of one or the other power. And this entails the two elements that I flagged, which is military rivalry and technological competition. Where military rivalry is concerned, the issues in my mind are at one level quite simple ones. They revolve around the capacity of the United States to continue its traditional role as being an effective protector of the Asian security order, and to underwrite the extended deterrence commitments it has made to its allies. Because China has a vested interest in preventing the United States from satisfying this ambition, because it wants to protect its own equities with respect to Taiwan and in the South China Sea and so on and so forth, there is going to be a very serious military competition between China and the United States, with China attempting to keep US military power as far as possible from its boundaries. And the United States, because it has to satisfy external deterrence obligations, seeking to find ways of buying back its military capacity to project power. This is going to be a long-term competition. It will be shaped both by the economic capabilities of the two sides, as well as the technological breakthroughs that both sides are attempting to pursue. It's a competition essentially without end. There will be no permanent equilibrium. Both sides will be pushing for advantage. But behind this military competition is a bigger competition, and that is the competition for technological advantage. We have long known that the leading states in the international system happen to be states that acquired the label of being leading states precisely because they were not simply geopolitically powerful, but because they were economically dominant. And they were economically dominant because they dominated the leading sectors of the age, whatever that age was. And so it's not surprising to me that underlying the military rivalries, underlying the struggles for influence, is again the same struggle to dominate the leading sectors of the global economy, both the leading sectors today and the leading sectors of tomorrow. And this is where I see a US-China rivalry as being quite incessant, even though both sides will be knitted together in terms of their own economic interactions. This rivalry, to my mind, will not impede so much the movement of goods, though President Trump tried mightily to break the sinews of interdependence, at least where merchandise trade between the United States and China was concerned. I do think, however, that the rivalry, even if it does not affect the movement of goods, will affect very much the movements of information, the movements of capital. It could affect the movement of services, but it'll certainly affect the movement of peoples. And the kind of free flow of peoples that we saw in the last 2 decades, of people being able to move across national boundaries, work across national boundaries, especially between China and the United States, I think that era is essentially over. So when one looks at the technological rivalries, I see its impact very much in terms of the impact on capital movements, the impact on the movement of information. And the Chinese, in fact, moved even faster than the US did very early on to segregate or to create a national system of information that would not be contaminated by the West. And I suspect, different parts of the world will sort of attempt to emulate the Chinese experience in different ways. And as I said, of course, the movement of peoples. The second dimension, I want to touch on this more briefly, is the pressures for deglobalization. These pressures, I think, reached a crescendo under President Trump because he had a view that economic globalization was essentially bad, fundamentally bad for the United States, and really made it part of his, administration's objectives to minimize U.S. Economic interdependence on others, especially on China. My own judgment, at least at the moment, is that this ambition has failed. That no matter what the administration's objectives were, those objectives, it was unable to meet those objectives because there were larger forces at play. And these larger forces have to do with essentially the movement of global capitalism on a multinational scale. And the administration simply did not have either the consistency of policy or the tools to essentially break down this globalization pattern, which had been slowly building up over 2 or 3 decades prior to President Trump's arrival in office. So my own judgment, at least at the moment, is that the pressures for deglobalization will appear in ragged form every now and then, but a short of war, neither China nor the United States will be able to break down the larger patterns of interdependence that exist in the global system. Those patterns of interdependence are going to persist simply because it is impossible right now to contain the movement of capital, to contain the movement of business across national boundaries. And I think short of a physical conflict between the United States and China, neither side will be able to curtail these transnational movements. So globalization actually will have, I think, a longer life than President Trump had hoped for or desired. But the fact of the matter is that the global trading system, in the broadest unified sense, is certainly fragmenting. The WTO today has become the lowest common denominator for economic intercourse across boundaries. It's not the highest ambition that we could imagine. The kinds of substitutes that have slowly been appearing are substitutes which are partial free trade agreements. And the tragedy at the moment is that the United States is not part of the major partial free trade agreements that have been materializing in Asia. It has sort of walked out of the TPP, perhaps hopefully not permanently, but certainly for the moment it's not part of it, leaving the Japanese to sort of maintain the arrangements until the US changes its mind. And the United States is not part of RCEP. The Regional Partnership for Economics, which has also now taken root in Asia. So the fragmentation sees the US out of these 2 very important trade groupings that have materialized. And I think that is not in America's interest. And so sooner or later, the US will have to make some decisions about whether it wants to be part of these new plurilaterals in Asia or not. And if it chooses to be permanently out of these plurilaterals, especially the TPP, then I suspect it will translate into lower influence in what is probably the most important, part of the world today. I spoke earlier about the fragmentation of peoples and data. And to that degree, I think the fears about deglobalization are real. There are no easy solutions to either of these issues, but I think we do run the risk of a much more fragmented global economic system if we cannot arrive at uniform rules for how we treat the movement of information and the movement of peoples. The last sort of disruptive force that has become very manifest in the last 2 years is, of course, the pandemic. And the pandemic has taken a toll, clearly, of global economic growth. It has taken a toll of all the major players in the Asian economic system. But its long-term consequences are still unclear. That it will have a retarding effect, I think, is beyond doubt. And its long-term effects, especially with respect to the distortion in the way factors of production can be allocated, I think those impacts will remain with us for a very long time. In fact, long after we defeat the pandemic itself. So it may be years, in fact, decades, before the global economic system actually returns to an equilibrium, because dealing with the pandemic has now created all manner of new economic distortions. It has put a premium on a renewed quest for self-sufficiency. Now in new sectors. In the old days, the only quest for self-sufficiency that people seemed to agree on was sensible, was in the area of strategic commerce and in defense trade. Now we've added public health as being one important sector where states are pursuing self-sufficiency. And in an ideal world, it should not be, because pandemics are a global bad. They are, the clearest form of a negative externality that you can imagine. And so in theory, the solution should be a collective solution. And yet, dealing with the COVID pandemic has demonstrated that a truly collective solution has eluded us, partly because of China's own malfeasance in aiding the efforts at investigating the origins of the pandemic. And also because the Chinese have used the pandemic, to sort of score cheap points in their rivalry with the West. And then, of course, the United States and other Western partners have had no choice but to sort of play the same game. So we've ended up in a position where even if we defeat the pandemic through a successful vaccination campaign, say over the next 2 to 3 years, we will still have put in place the ingredients for a much more inefficient global economic system, because we will end up creating redundancies in production. We will be stimulating large-scale national efforts at import substitution in different ways, and so on and so forth. So the long-term costs of the pandemic on global growth, to my mind, are still questions that do not have easy answers. Having said that, though, the near term seems to suggest some more disconcerting trends. China, which was the first victim of the pandemic, appears to have made the best comeback of all the nations affected by it, in part because its authoritarian political system has enabled it to deal with the pandemic far more resolutely than more open systems. The US, too, has the ingredients for a comeback, because one of the smartest legacies that President Trump may have left us was Operation Warp Speed and the state-supported efforts at developing a vaccine in double quick time. That certainly has paid off. But the tragedy is that we are held back now by huge pockets of vaccine hesitancy, which are preventing the United States from reaping the gains of the early investments in vaccine development and vaccine production. And so it would be tragic if these self-inflicted wounds, which appear now in the form of vaccine hesitancy, prevent the entire US population from being vaccinated as fast as we possibly could. And then the United States becoming a base for the global production and the global distribution of vaccines. This could be one consequence of some of the choices that we are making today. And whether we will be able to overcome this through more state-directed incentives is something that I keep my fingers crossed. We'll have to wait and see. Finally, I want to make the point that our allies in Asia are not doing too well with respect to coping with the pandemic too. So you see Japan struggling Japan, the Republic of Korea, even Australia, Singapore, all coping with the pandemic in different ways, all struggling on one hand to expand vaccination, on another hand to flatten the curves and mitigate the consequences of the spikes that periodically arise. And to my mind, the fact that our allies are still suffering the consequences of the pandemic leaves me concerned, because it does have long-term geopolitical implications if they cannot get their arms around this problem. So when we look out over the next 3 to 5 years, I see the global economic system still battered as a result of the pandemic. There will be a comeback, there's no question, but there will be losses, and these losses will be unequally shared. Second, I think the future of the global trading system itself now is a big question mark, because it does not seem obvious to me that we will have enough international consensus either to reform the WTO and modernize it, make it a better instrument for global trade all around, nor do I see the United States able to summon the will to join these other plurilateral agreements, which would be essential for success in Asia. And finally, the future of long-term US-China competition, I think, is still an issue that whose history has yet to be written. As I said, we are still in the earliest phases, and much will depend on the choices that are made both in Washington and in Beijing. So why don't I end, Michael, on that note, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thanks very much, Ashley. And in our second half of the event, we'll hear expert speakers address some of those regional reactions from their respective countries of focus. I'd like to start off by asking you a couple of questions. And just a reminder for all of our audience, if you have questions, please channel them by email to events@nbr.org. And the team behind the scenes will feed those to me, and I'll in turn pose those to you, Ashley. But I want to start with a couple that came to mind as I was listening to you talk. You're describing, and I agree with your assessment, that the Trump administration, at least in style, was very different from previous US administrations and did certainly kick the competition with China into a higher gear. I've been quite struck myself at how much continuity and sort of similarities the Biden team seems to have taken, at least in these early months. So the new national security strategy, you said, is going to be released this summer. Are you anticipating any big departures or surprises from the team as President Biden releases that strategy in terms of Washington's preferred objectives toward the region?
It's less a question of surprises and more a question of granularity. I think the continuity will be in terms of affirming the enduring quality of Sino-American competition. I think that's going to be a clear continuity. But the issue of how exactly we go about it, I think, is what the administration will have to define more clearly for itself, for the country, and equally importantly for our allies, because everyone is waiting with bated breath to see how the Biden administration will pursue the competition with China in contrast to its predecessor. So It's not the fact of the competition that I think will be repudiated or changed, but the clarity with which that competition is to be pursued is something that everyone is waiting for.
Then thanks. Let me follow up a couple of quick questions then. For the competition to be prosecuted successfully, the United States needs to have a clear and commonly agreed upon, even among political rivals, objective, in the same way that during the Cold War, whether it was a Republican or a Democratic administration, there was a clear sense that the competition with the Soviet Union was a national priority. My sense of the mood here in Washington, D.C. over the last few years is we've made progress towards that. Go on Capitol Hill today, and no matter who you're speaking to, there's a lot of consensus amongst the policy elite in Washington about the fact of the competition with China, the importance of waging that competition. In the context of the pandemic, you're describing this sort of vaccine hesitancy in certain parts of the United States. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that sense of national purpose, because if I think specifically about the relationship between the United States and China, in the business community, which has long been a champion of engagement with China, or in our universities, which have long had deep relations with China and sort of large numbers of Chinese students coming to the United States and shared collaboration for academic endeavors, how well is US society writ large gearing up for this more competitive relationship? If, as you suspect, the new national security strategy will sort of enshrine competition as part of long-term US thinking.
I fear that we don't have that kind of a consensus. And that's why the granularity of the administration strategy will actually become critical. Because at the end of the day, where different constituencies come out on the question of competition will be shaped substantially by what aspects of the strategy produce gains or losses for them. And you can see this already, although there's a broad convergence between Republicans and Democrats that China is a challenge. What the means for dealing with that challenge should be are not easily agreed upon. We know what the Biden administration is attempting. What the Biden administration seems to be attempting is an inside-out strategy, which is to invest in the United States and rebuild the foundations of American power at home in order to be better able to cope with the challenges of China abroad. I mean, that is the essence of what the administration's foreign policy for the middle class means. You sort of strengthen your capacities at home, and that makes you more capable of competing with the Chinese over the long term. But, that strategy is contested. It's not obvious to me that the Republicans believe that that is, in fact, the right kind of strategy. They are concerned about what they see as a dramatic expansion of state power over the power of markets. They do appear to have, occasionally at least, concerns about what large investment programs would do for the national deficit, and so on and so forth. And there are debates about what resources ought to be allocated for military expenditures, including, the presence of the United States militarily in different parts of the world. So when it comes to the details, I think there are still substantial divides among the two principal parties. And I suspect those divisions are actually indicative of divisions within our own society. So at the superficial level, there are disagreements between parties, but at more fundamental levels, I think there are disagreements between different strata in American society itself. And therefore, I think part of what the administration has to do is to socialize the American people to what the realities of competition with China entail in this new age of interdependence. And so we've had a series of articles written by, folks like Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, but I think everyone is waiting now for official statements of administration policy.
I agree. Let me ask you, and I'm picking up a couple of questions from the chat. Thank you for your audience members for sharing those. On the one hand, actually, in your remarks, you're quite optimistic about the future of globalization, and yet you also described a series of challenges to that. And I mean, whether it's in different standards about data privacy and data transfer, and obviously that's going to be an important part of trade going forward, given the amount of digital services that are part of trade, whether it's self-sufficiency and concerns about securing supply chains in the context of COVID and expanding what are now considered strategic or critical industries and sectors, whether it's the use of sanctions and investment controls as a matter of statecraft, and we see that by both Washington and Beijing. All of these things are complicating life for businesses. And certainly in the administration's current statements, my read is that they are focused, as you said, on building back the US middle class, focusing domestically, trying to address some of those priorities in terms of domestic economic growth and recovery. I'm curious if the United States can really afford to focus only on that and not continue to be engaged regionally. I mean, you described earlier how Japan and Australia and other middle powers were stepping up, keeping TPP alive in the form of CTPP. But how much longer are regional allies and partners able to wait? And a related question, I guess, would be, even if they're able to wait much longer, how open are they to sort of seeing Washington reemerge as a regional leader? Or is the Biden administration going to need to figure out how to manage those relations with allies and partners in a slightly different fashion than traditional US presidents perhaps had to do?
Well, those are a series of really important questions, and let me answer them in the following way. First, I don't think the United States will have the luxury of keeping its external engagements on autopilot until it rebuilds itself. I mean, that's what, small powers do. I mean, great powers must be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So even as we continue to rebuild our domestic capabilities, we are not going to have the luxury of sort of, having the world wait on us until we can sort of stage that comeback. So we're going to have to do the same. We're going to have to do both together. And I think it's something that our allies expect because they see their own environments getting more complicated. And they cannot wait for the United States to, in a sense, get its act together. So I think part of what the administration will have to do is to demonstrate that even as it continues to look inwards and rebuild the US, it is not doing it by sacrificing America's time, attention, and priorities abroad. But there are legitimate questions, I think, especially in Asian capitals, about whether the United States can pull this off. And only time will tell, whether the skeptics or the optimists are correct.
And then, thank you. A question from the chat, and I think a final question for you, given the time we have here, and then we'll move into our second half of the event. On the one hand, there's a way to re-engage economically, whether it's through sort of US beginning discussions with CPTPP partners or potentially considering RCEP or looking at other forms of multilateral sort of trade arrangements in the region. On the other hand, we have both from Washington and many other countries in the Asia-Pacific, some form of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which, as I see it, is really more of a sort of values-based way of looking at how to organize regional relations, more on the political side of things than the economic side of things. Is there a priority between those two? Does one have to happen first, or do those two need to go hand in hand to be truly effective?
No, they have to go hand in hand. Whatever we are doing in terms of economic regeneration has to occur in tandem with the investments we make in the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific, I would just like to make the point that while the element of values are important, they cannot be the fulcrum on which you base an Indo-Pacific strategy. An Indo-Pacific strategy will have to be constructed on the very simple realities of power. And we will not have the luxury of choosing our friends based on the values they have. We will have to construct a coalition and partnership simply based on the importance of countries and their willingness to join us in protecting our interests in the Indo-Pacific. Really a power calculation, not a values calculation.
That I'd love to have time to dig further into that with you, Ashley, but I think we're going to move on to our second panel. Thank you so much for those framing remarks. Many of the themes that Ashley's just described are ones that we're addressing in the forthcoming volume of Strategic Asia, which will be released in January of 2022. So stay tuned for that. None of our other panelists today are contributors to that volume, just to set the record straight from the outset. But we'll look forward to re-engaging with many of you in a few months' time as we launch that new book. Ashley, I hope you can stick around for as long as your schedule allows. But let me now introduce the rest of our speakers, and we'll start to dig into the regional reactions to some of Ashley's remarks.
Thank you.
I'm going to go in alphabetical order for panelist introductions and just do this very briefly. But we have four experts here this afternoon with us. First, Jack Gill, who's an associate professor at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University here in Washington, D.C., and a several-time contributor to our Strategic Asia series focusing on India. Secondly, Yuka Koshino, who's a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, joining us this evening from London. So thank you very much, Yuka, for staying up late this evening to take part in this discussion. And Yuka's recently been working with NBR on some initiatives focusing on the regional reactions to sort of China's military modernization and how Washington is responding to that. Third up, Tiffany Ma, whose former office I'm sitting in here, a colleague at NBR, where she used to run our political and security affairs group before she moved across to Bauer Group Asia. And she will be speaking on Taiwan. And then last but not least, Michael Wesley, who is currently the Vice Chancellor at the University of Melbourne, but began first interacting, I believe, with NBR when he was at the Australian National University, and also a contributor to previous Strategic Asia volumes. So Michael, thank you for getting up very early this morning for this discussion today. I'm actually going to start by asking the panelists to address the same question, and feel free to speak for a few minutes on this. But from the perspective of your country, and we're really looking here at Australia, India, Japan, and Taiwan, thinking about the themes that Ashley was describing, deepening US-China competition, these pressures toward deglobalization, and in Ashley's words, sort of the absence of Washington, D.C. as a major economic force in the region, not just over the last 4 years, but for several years before that, arguably. And of course, then the pandemic. Those three forces, how are those affecting your country's current strategic outlook? I mean, as you're sitting, Michael, and I'm going to start with you, but just talk for a couple more minutes to let you collect your thoughts. If you're looking at Canberra and thinking about how Australian policymakers are looking at these major forces shaping the region, how are Australian policymakers trying to position the country to further its interests in the context that we've been discussing here this afternoon?
Michael, thank you. And can I thank Ashley for his absolutely fascinating comments as well. It's great to be part of this forum and absolutely crucial questions that we're addressing. Can I suggest that there's a theme that I'd like to pick out that I think runs through Ashley's analysis, and that is, and I believe that it's a theme that all US allies and other countries in the region are responding to, and that is what I would call the logic of polarization. That the US-China rivalry that is deepening, and I absolutely agree with everything that Ashley said about that, is starting to exert increasing polarization pressures on third parties in the Indo-Pacific region. I say that because I think that there are a number of elements that play into this. I think that the United States and many of its allies have really, in the past decade or so, come out of a phase, a 40-year phase of believing that China could be socialized into the norms and beliefs and values of the broader region through a pattern of deep engagement with China. And from the hope that China would see that its own interests were very much aligned with becoming aligned with the existing institutions and norms of the region. As the United States and its allies have become disillusioned with that particular strategy, I think they've started to engage on what you might call the polar opposite of that strategy, which is to try to demonstrate to China that the consequences of it not complying with regional norms is increasing disengagement and confrontation. And I think if I can be very brief, I think China has been pursuing the opposite strategy. That is, it sees that the interest of the United States is to try and encourage other countries to isolate China, and China has been pursuing a counter-isolation policy, if you like, through various initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative and other policies as well. So I think all of these play into the three elements that Ashley outlined, the rivalry, the deglobalization, and the patterns, if I could say, of deglobalization, but also interdependence, and also perceptions and reactions to the pandemic as well. I highlight the logic of polarization because I think it is a key element to understanding how third parties in the Indo-Pacific are reacting to really the deepening rivalry between the United States and China and the other attendant elements that Ashley was talking about. It's particularly interesting because I think we've gone through a broad arc, if you like, of reactions of third-party states to the logic of polarization. I think you could say almost universally across the Indo-Pacific, if you were to go back a decade, there was almost a universal interest in trying to avoid the logic of polarization. There was a very clear pattern, particularly representative, I might say, in many of the US allies in the region, of a close strategic relationship with the United States, but a deepening economic relationship with China. And so there was very clear national interest considerations when countries said in their various ways, we have no interest in choosing either the United States or China. We want to remain with our equities invested in both of these major powers. We want to retain our strategic relationship with the United States. We want to maintain or do what we can to maintain the stabilizing influence of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. But we have an interest in, of course, deepening and benefiting from our deepening economic engagement with China. I don't think you can say that that is universally the case anymore. And I think if I can suggest that the most dramatic case of the switch from resisting the logic of polarization to accepting and perhaps even promoting the logic of polarization has been most stark in the case of my own country, Australia. I think in the past 5 years, if I can nominate that time frame, Australia has, I think, lost confidence that it could resist the logic of polarization. Australia has lost confidence that it can maintain a broadly positive relationship with China while maintaining its strategic relationship with the United States. So in that time, Australia has taken has made a number of moves and decisions that have, I think, irreparably shifted its relationship with China from being one of broad engagement, broad optimism, mutual partnership for mutual benefit, to one of increasing confrontation with China. Let me just quickly talk about some of the elements of that timeline. I think by far the most significant development that has impacted Australian attitudes has been Chinese policy in the South China Sea. Australia sees the South China Sea as an absolutely crucial economic link between Australia and North Asia, which is where the majority of Australian trade goes, not only to China, but also to Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. Australia has had a great deal invested in the maintenance of the South China Sea as an international waterway, and also in the South China Sea as a crucial piece of strategic landscape, if you like, or waterscape, in maintaining the strategic status quo in Asia and the Indo-Pacific. The thing that most alarmed Australia was China's militarization of features in the South China Sea. That has profound implications for Australia's defence policy, because for the first time since 1942, a major power other than Australia's major ally has the capacity to mount direct attacks on the Australian mainland. This has constricted Australia's warning time in terms of its defence policy and had profound effects on the way that we see the strategic environment. So that's a major element of Australia's reaction and negative reaction to China. Secondly, Australia has become much more concerned about China's influence operations domestically within Australia, be it cyber attacks on the Australian Parliament, be it influence operations against Australian politicians and parliamentarians. And now the most recent phase is a growing concern about China's influence on Australian university campuses. The third element is Australia's concern about China's technological development. And Australia was, of course, a first mover in barring Huawei from constructing or having any part in the construction of Australia's 4G and now 5G mobile telephony networks. So Australia has reacted with alarm, and this has caused Australia, I think, to become highly accepting of the idea that the only way that China's ambitions can be checked is by confronting China and by isolating China in many different ways. China, of course, has reacted very badly to this. It sees Australia as a bit of an upstart country, I would say, a country to be made an example of, and has instituted a range of trade measures against Australia. I don't think we've seen the end of those trade measures. I think we will see the increase in Chinese pressure. I think China is probably surprised that Australia hasn't buckled to the economic pressure that it's applied to Australia, and I think it will probably double down on a lot of that pressure. I think that there is probably more pain yet to come for the Australian economy into the future. The very last thing I would say is that I believe that the Australian government has embarked on a policy that is really reinforcing the logic of polarisation. I think the Australian government sees its own interest in showing the real face of China, if you like, in demonstrating how coercive China can be if its interests are not followed, and in using its own example to increase the alarm of other countries in the region about China's behaviour, and to force them, or not force them, to encourage them to reconceive their own interests in terms of what they're going to do about China. I think this was most clearly exemplified during the recent G7 summit in the United Kingdom, where the Australian Prime Minister attended as a guest of the United Kingdom, along with the leaders of India and South Korea and other regional countries. It was regarded, I think, as an important milestone that the United States, Japan, and the major European democracies provided strong rhetorical support for Australia in its confrontation with China, and really lined up behind Australia. That was seen, I think, in Canberra as a major foreign policy success. The challenge for Australia will be to maintain its relationships not only with the United States but with its other major partners in Asia, while its relations with China continue to deteriorate. The main threat to Australia's national interests at this phase of its foreign policy is that its confrontation with China will go too far, that its confrontational relationship with Beijing will be something that starts to separate it from its other crucial relationships in North Asia with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, in Southeast Asia with the ASEAN countries, and of course in South Asia with India. So this is a crucial time for Australia. It is unprecedented territory. It's completely unprecedented for determining how to continue to operate in this newly conflictual environment. And the policy not only of the United States, but of other significant partners for Australia in the region in how they navigate the growing geopolitical competition is going to be an absolutely crucial contextual factor for the future of Australian foreign policy. Michael, I'll leave my remarks there.
Great, Michael, thank you so much for that. This is a nice follow-on from Ashley's remarks, and you've actually provided me a really good hook for the person I want to call on next. I'd like to move clockwise around the region we're talking about, around China. And Jack, I'm going to come to you next. Michael's just described Australia sort of being in a much more confrontational relationship with China. India, of course, has actually had a confrontation with China on the border in the last couple of years, and a long series of a history of these interactions over decades. So let me use Michael's words on this logic of polarization and ask you to unpack a little bit from Delhi's perspective how India thinks about that, because we're talking about a country that has long tried to avoid getting sucked into these sorts of bipolar dynamics. I mean, this is India, the sort of the big leader in the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. But obviously the same pressures that Michael's described Australia facing are facing the Indian government too. So could you give us your thoughts on how India is navigating some of these challenging forces across the region?
Yes, happy to. And indeed, Michael, I really agree with your comments, first off, on the efforts of countries to engage China and the tragedy that has not worked over the past several decades. And as I was listening to you, I was making notes on the side of my own paper that what my remarks will echo yours in several points. And in particular, I put down in quotation marks, don't worry, I'll footnote you, this logic of polarization point. Because for the past 2 or 3 decades, Michael, as you've outlined, India has tried to walk a very careful strategic line between the United States and China, if we just tie the polarization to those two poles, doing enough to keep Washington on side without antagonizing Beijing, and occasionally collaborating with China, even when that caused irritations in Washington. And India was actually keen to preclude some kind of a US-China condominium, what they call the G2, about which many people in Delhi entertained rather exaggerated fears. Delhi was certainly closer to Washington, but it maintained a laudable modus vivendi on this contested border with China for a long, long time, remained confident of its own predominance in the Indian Ocean, and ended up with China being its major trading partner, its largest trading partner, albeit biased, the trade biased in China's favor. In my opinion, again, echoing your comments, Michael, China's behavior is what began to change this relatively comfortable calculus several years ago. Not just the very ugly incidents from last year in 2020, but 2017 with a crisis on the border, several previous border incursions, all against the backdrop of this broadly aggressive Chinese behavior, the South China Sea, wolf warrior pugnacity, etc. Compounded for Indians by their perception of Sino-Pakistani collusion dating at least to 2009. So this increase in tension and uncertainty vis-a-vis China has had several effects in my view. First off, if you just think about the crisis last year, the visuals of US military equipment being shown repeatedly on Indian media, landing in these remote areas, helicopters flying, a lot of attention to artillery pieces and other bits of US military gear, really quite striking and completely different from what you would have seen even, say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And what may be an effort to, so there's a greater focus from the Indian standpoint on the rich relations with the United States, greater closeness, greater content, greater focus on the Quad, at least as a vehicle to caution China, if nothing else. And what might be an effort on Delhi's part to reduce the threats on its western border. And that is both reducing the chances of confrontation with Pakistan, as we've seen in a revival of the ceasefire along their contested line of control in Kashmir, and also in new moves to talk to the Taliban in Afghanistan and thereby reduce that threat to India. India has also tried to revive its relations with its various Indian Ocean island neighbors. There's been pluses and minuses there, successes and failures, but it's certainly making an effort in that regard. And it might even be looking to present itself as kind of a kinder, gentler international partner in Africa as a means of competing with China. Now, there's an important caveat in New Delhi's perception. There are a lot, I should say, specifically not the government of India, but there are many in the Indian policy community, policy elites, if you will, who remains very skeptical about the United States. There's a long tradition of skepticism, suspicion about the US, and that's a challenge for US diplomacy. So if we shift from that US-China competition to the health crisis that you talked about, Michael, this has been a major setback for India's efforts to become a leading power on the global stage. The rather poor response to the pandemic, especially the second wave, has certainly created doubts outside of India about the competence and capacity of the government in all spheres of endeavor, so not just healthcare, but elsewhere, especially because that poor handling of the health crisis comes on top of distressingly illiberal trends in domestic politics over the past several years. So this has all been very damaging to India's image and its soft power, previously a very strong suit from New Delhi's perspective, and therefore damaging to its attractiveness as a model to emulate. And as far as deglobalization is concerned, this international trend has, I think, reinforced the protectionist and rather nativist proclivities that have been embedded in India's political culture since its independence. Especially evident in India's rejection of the RCEP late last year, and as well as in the Prime Minister's doubling down, if you will, on self-reliance and Make in India. Something that many analysts, not all, certainly there are those who laud the government for this, but many analysts see this as presaging some kind of an anachronistic return to economic autarky, the sort of system that was evident in India, say, in the 1950s. For me, it's hard to see how this inward turn serves India's long-term goals. Indeed, to me, it makes these goals much more difficult to attain. But such moves resonate with much of the electorate and are largely shared, strangely enough, by the main opposition party in India. So with that, and with the caveat that although I have to issue the appropriate disclaimer that although I am now fully retired from government service, I was a part of the US government for many years and in various capacities, and I remain affiliated with this Near East South Asia Center, but my remarks are entirely my own and don't reflect by any means anybody in the US government. I write this all up myself, so please take that as my own personal opinions. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Jack. And duly noted on your comments are yours alone. Let's move across to Japan now. Yuka, obviously Tokyo has faced the same kinds of challenges that Michael described Canberra's facing, that Jack has just described Delhi facing. We've seen on the one hand, certainly my visits to Tokyo in the last few years, Japanese policymakers talking about this, trying to sort of navigate this balance between maintaining the strong alliance with the United States and yet recognizing that China is a very important trade and economic partner for Japan. Give us your sense of how you think Prime Minister Suga has been sort of handling this increasing intensification of the competition between the US and China in the context of COVID.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me to begin with. I think the previous speaker, Michael, talked about the logic of polarization. I think even before the Suga administration and going back to the Abe administration, probably the common themes from the three trends that you highlighted in the beginning, in Japan's, probably Tokyo's kind of perspective, maybe the common theme would be enhancing resilience in three different ways. That is like kind of this emerging central theme, I think, in Japan's thinking of grand strategy. First, the increasingly emerging theme that's been discussed right now is by the government, but also by politicians and even the businesses, would be the economic resilience. So this has, from Japan's perspective, this has some, in a way, maybe a decade of history for Japan's effort to first enhance economic resilience and I guess China's potential use of geoeconomic power. For Japan, the turning point was when in 2010, when the Chinese trawlers and the Japanese Coast Guard ship had a collision around the Senkaku Islands, and when the Japanese government detained one of the crew members, and when China responded by halting the rare earth exports. That was kind of the beginning of Japan's increasing sensitivity towards dependence on China on certain strategic goods. And since then, Japan has diversified efforts, especially on rare earth, but Japan was always probably a little more attentive about the China's use of economic coercion in certain cases. And COVID-19 also, in a more recent context, probably further accelerated Japan's such effort. Even before COVID-19, Japan was kind of already thinking about diversification of a supply chain for semiconductors, especially under the US and China strategic competition. This was kind of a risk for Japan, the risk of depending on China, but also the risk of potential Japanese companies potentially being associated with China. So the economic ministry, for instance, has already been looking at the supply chain. But because of COVID-19, there's, as Ashley has mentioned in his remarks, the medical goods, including masks, ventilators, and vaccines, all became very important part of the conversation of Japan's efforts to enhance supply chain resilience. And that was why Japan was quite quick and swift to include the budget, supplemental budget in early 2020 to for instance, kind of move the production line of some strategic goods out of China and potentially back to Japan or Southeast Asia. And another driver for Japan's focus to enhance economic resilience was in the context of US-China competition that I just mentioned, that when the former president, Trump, pursued America First trade policy and often took unilateral kind of sanctions against technology companies dealing with China without the consultations with its allies. Now we have a new president, but a new administration who is more willing to coordinate and cooperate with allies on supply chain resiliency or economic sanctions against China, but still this administration is seeking a partial decoupling from China and sees technology as a center of the competition between US and China. So Japan is still kind of struggling with this, how to what extent that it has to think about partial decoupling from China. Second resilience element would be more on the defense side. So it's more in the context of the US-Japan alliance. During the Abe administration, one of the highlights for US-Japan alliance was really the 2015 update of the guidelines, which included, which covered enhanced cooperation from peacetime to contingency in covering new domains like space and cyber. And Japan has since then, for instance, the upgrading of the defense strategy and procurement strategy in 2018, which addressed the importance of new domains like space and cyber and electromagnetics. And these are very important because Japanese and military operation really relies on satellites, and Japan's also cyber, both civilian and military cyber networks are said to be quite vulnerable against Chinese cyber attacks. So these elements of resilience is becoming more and more increasingly gaining attention in Tokyo. And then the third would probably be most important from the Japan's foreign policy perspective, but it's the resilience of the rules-based liberal order in the Indo-Pacific region. So the U.S. focus on U.S. increasing focus more on the domestic political and economic challenges really raised increasing awareness in Japan that Japan really needs to step up as a promoter of the rules-based order to fill in the gap in U.S. leadership. And also worth mentioning that the expectation from the regional countries like Southeast Asia, if you look at the polls in the region, you'll see that there's a growing demand for Japan to take a more increasing leadership role in the region's regional order building. And then under Prime Minister Abe, the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that was launched in 2016 has really served as a vehicle to ensure the rule of law, the promotion of free, open, and inclusive trade, as we have seen in Japan's effort to conclude the CPTPP, as we've discussed, or setting high quality standards for infrastructure development, or even calling for transparent information sharing for COVID, like for instance, in the venues like ASEAN +3 last year, are all efforts for Japan to try to maintain this rules-based liberal order, even at times of kind of deglobalization and health crisis. And these are all the kind of the direction that was set under Prime Minister Abe, was a kind of strong leadership and his long term, but also which the Prime Minister Suga has also committed first day in office to continue. And so far, we've seen that, especially around the free and open Indo-Pacific, now the United States supported it, and then there's Australia, India, and then there's the Southeast Asia's ARP, which is also has similar elements to it, and then the United Kingdom, France, and Germany are all starting to kind of echo this idea of free, inclusive, and open Indo-Pacific. So I think this is how Japan is trying to respond to the situation, and so far, Prime Minister Suga has been able to continue on this course. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yuka. Let's swing slightly now to the south and have our fourth and final panelist, Tiffany Ma, really address the same set of questions from the perspective of Taiwan, which has obviously been in a confrontational relationship with China for many decades.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And I want to start by expressing my appreciation to NBR for having me here today. I want to start by echoing Ashley's point about China's intentions. I mean, China's actions in recent years have really underscored that it is not a status quo power. Under Xi Jinping, China has sought to create an external environment that's conducive to China's national interests rather than advancing its interests within the current international system. So as Ashley mentioned, trying to shape the world rather than be shaped by it. And one of its strategic interests that it's trying to accomplish in the international system is, of course, its long desired unification with Taiwan. And this is something, as you mentioned, that far precedes US-China competition, trends towards deglobalization, and the COVID-19 pandemic. But the fact that the pressures against Taiwan, China's use of coercion, for example, trying to change the facts of the ground, have persisted through a global pandemic in a very unrelenting way. And when we saw that the biggest military incursion flight from China actually took place in June of this year. And China has repeatedly sort of impeded Taiwan's COVID-19 response by barring Taiwan from participating at the WHO, by interfering with Taiwan's procurement of the Pfizer vaccine, and also through spreading significant amounts of disinformation in Taiwan. So, I mean, this goes to show that China will continue to take a very hard line on cross-strait issues going forward. On the other hand, though, some of these trends that we've seen in US-China relations and sort of the polarization that Michael mentioned have actually created a little bit of space for Taiwan to maneuver as an international actor. And here I really want to highlight two key developments relating to Taiwan's overall strategic outlook. The first is Taiwan's increasing push to multilateralize its security by deepening its relationships with like-minded countries, especially at a time when the regional order is under so much stress. Taiwan has been able to expand its relationships with both the United States and as well as allies and partners, including with Japan and even India in very significant ways. So what we've seen more recently is the ability to cast the cross-strait issue from not just an issue between Beijing and Taipei, which is China's preferred way of addressing it, but really putting it in the spotlight as an issue of international consequence and broadening the international stakeholders in the Taiwan Strait security as well. And, trends like deglobalization has prompted the diversification away from reliance on China in the global supply chain, and actually has also highlighted Taiwan's role as a strategic economic partner, especially on issues relating to semiconductors. The second trend I want to highlight how these recent developments have affected Taiwan's overall strategic outlook is the fact that I think Taiwan is much more able to shape its own narrative on the global stage. As the US-China competition intensified over ideology, for example, posing democracy against authoritarianism, Taiwan was able to leverage its very much thriving democracy to garner support and build its relations, especially as the United States and other countries sort of take a look at the importance of values such as democracy and human rights. And Taiwan has also been able to demonstrate itself as a desirable and reliable partner. I mean, the slogan that Taiwan likes to use is Taiwan can help, but it in fact actually has been doing so during the COVID-19 pandemic, through the donations of PPEs and through engagements with other countries where it's able to sort of leverage its understanding of the PLA as being subject to a lot of the PLA coercion and its experiences as sort of being the ground zero for a lot of China's disinformation and cyber attack attempts. So, I mean, Taiwan is able to really leverage a lot of its knowledge, its learnings and experiences, and use that to help other countries in addressing their own challenges with regards to China. And this is really a window of opportunity that I think Taiwan has not had for a long time. Beijing has long tried to shape the cross-strait narrative by really highlighting its view on the inevitability of unification and really trying to undermine Taiwan in the eyes of other external stakeholders. So I would say overall, the external environment for Taiwan has developed in probably a more positive way than perhaps it has for Australia, Japan, or India. And I think the US-China competition and deglobalization and COVID-19 has really elevated Taiwan's international importance and deepened its relationships with like-minded countries. So I'll leave it there and I look forward to questions.
Thanks. Actually, I'm going to have you stay on, Tiffany, and answer this first, and then circle back in reverse order to the remarks you've just made. This idea of like-minded countries is the one I'd like to explore. All of you in different ways have mentioned these sort of your country's responses and collaboration with other regional powers, extra-regional powers, absent the US, and whether that's been because of US absence or a perceived absence of US leadership. But Tiffany, can you tell me a little bit from your perspective how you're seeing Taiwan leverage specific bilateral relationships I've been very struck just recently with the kinds of statements coming from Tokyo about the importance of Taiwan as a sort of major security concern for Japan. But who else is Taipei looking to sort of to deepen this web of like-minded allies and partners? And then, forewarning for Yuka, Jack, and Michael, I'm going to circle back and sort of ask you the same question. So imagine the US sort of continuing to be absent or semi-absent. Which other partners is Japan, India, Australia looking to play that important role in helping to shape this this complex strategic region? But Tiffany, over to you first.
Thanks, Michael. Building off what you just mentioned, I think the support from Japan is particularly significant. You know, we're seeing high-level statements, whether intentional or unintentional, to be determined, about the importance of Taiwan and also the importance specifically of Taiwan Strait security for Japan being talked about in a very open way. In Japan's defense white paper, they mentioned for the first time the strategic importance of stabilizing the Taiwan situation. And of course, cross-strait tensions or conflict would be something that affects Japan very directly, whether it's Japan's interest in the regional order or First Island chain vulnerability. Taiwan has also been building relations with Southeast Asia and India, especially under the new southbound policy of President Tsai, which has more of a focus on economic relations and people-to-people exchange. But I will say overall, the most important relationship for Taiwan still very much remains the United States. And there, I think, as Ashley mentioned, there's been this pretty significant continuity, especially from the last administration on the topic of Taiwan, but with more of an emphasis on the importance of Taiwan's democracy and having a more comprehensive relationship with Taiwan. So we saw the restarted TIFA talks a few weeks ago and expanding cooperation on certain economic issues such as semiconductors. And that's really boosted by the strong support actually from Congress as well. So in this administration, the Biden administration, we've seen some very substantive and very symbolic early wins in the US-Taiwan relationship. And I think that's going to continue to be the focus of Taiwan's strategic relationships.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yuka, let's go over to you.
Sure. I think, so Tiffany mentioned a very important part about this Japan's new defense white paper that came out. And it's very interesting that it says the stability of situations around Taiwan is important for security of Japan and the international community. I think that the last part is really important, and on what I've been observing over the past, even just the past several months. But I think Japan's, in terms of kind of alliances and regional kind of multilateral groupings or multilateral groupings, as we have seen over the past several months, the Quad, for instance, for Japan. I mean, Japan has Prime Minister Abe, even back in 2007, 2008, is kind of like the initiator of this idea of this security diamond or the Quad. But now it seems like it has become kind of a center venue for US-Japan cooperation, even beyond the military cooperation, but also on critical and emerging technology, or even COVID-19 or climate change issues. So Quad is growing, gaining momentum, and is probably going to be an important part of Japan's regional kind of orders building. But I also do see that G7, for instance, is also still remains as a critical venue for Japan. And there, Japan also highlighted Taiwan's issues, and Japan's also increasingly engaging with EU. And in the recent summit between EU and Japan, Taiwan was also discussed in this context. And now, because NATO is also increasing awareness of this is more of a kind of an emerging, I think, potential partner that I'm talking about. But as they grow more interested in resilience, and as they become more aware of the increasing need to understand about the China threat, there's growing momentum and interest between both parties to start engaging. I've seen, just being in London, I've seen increasing track 2 and track 1.5 around Japan, EU, US, or Japan, US, Japan, NATO cooperation, kind of the cross-regional alliances coordination. So I see that Japan's trying to play kind of like a role to bring together the both regions, both Asia and also the in Europe, especially after when the previous administration in the United States had a not necessarily a positive, I mean, not a very good relationship with in terms of the transatlantic relations, and I think that's where kind of Japan's effort to try to bridge that is coming. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Jack, let's come over to you.
Thanks, Michael. I'll highlight first that all of these four countries we're dealing with here have important economic relations with China. It's easy to forget that China remains India's major trading partner. And so all of these countries have to deal with this problem of how do you cope with an economic tie at the same time that you're trying to fend off what you perceive as seriously aggressive Chinese behavior. But India is unique in at least two ways. And one of those is that it's the only country that shares an actual land border, so 4,000 kilometers or so with China. And secondly, that it does not have a direct formal alliance relationship with the United States. So that gets to your very interesting question. And I think from a Delhi perspective, one of the first places they look is Tokyo. And we can look back to Prime Minister Abe and the tremendous focus that he placed on India, and that was certainly reciprocated by Indians and led to, among other things, not just the Quad, but this trilateral US, Japan, India discussion or dialogue. India also looks to Vietnam, despite its fairly small size within ASEAN, and to European countries more on a bilateral than in an EU kind of format, but nonetheless there is some discussion with the EU as well, but certainly to the UK and to France as countries that have specific interests of their own in the Indo-Pacific. And then there's Russia. And this is extremely problematic because of the long-standing relationship between Moscow and New Delhi. But with increasing Russian-China friendship, it places India in a very difficult position. So we find last year, in the midst of this crisis on the border, the Indian defense minister is in Moscow along with the Chinese defense minister. And the Indian defense minister's major mission was to get an urgent resupply of spare parts and ammunition and other things to fend off Chinese aggression while the three are having a meeting in Moscow. So that's a problematic, difficult, and evolving relationship. So we'll have to see where that all goes. But I would come back to the Quad and highlight, as Tiffany did, if I may paraphrase, that for many Indians who would not have said so years ago, at least not openly, recognize that there is no replacement for the United States. And the Quad is a vehicle that allows India to deal with the United States and deal with other like-minded key partners, Australia, Japan, and then broaden that to include Quad Plus, UK, France, other countries as they're brought in, be those Singapore or others. So I think that kind of is a hierarchy, but it does come back to the Quad and the value, the increased value that India sees in that organization or that dialogue.
Thanks, Jack. Michael, let's go back down to you here.
Let me go back to the Defence White Paper, the Australian Defence White Paper, the most recent one of 2017, which really sets out Australia's approach to building strategic partnerships in Asia. It's regarded as somewhat of an inside joke among the strategic studies community here in Australia as Plan B. And it's very much a product of the Trump administration. So real concern around US commitment to remaining in the Indo-Pacific during the Trump administration has really led Australia to double down on trying to build strategic partnerships in Asia. The key players for Australia are, number one, Japan. The relationship with Japan has been deepening for well over a decade now. And the strategic alignment between the two countries is becoming much more serious. The second country that Australia is building a very strong partnership with is India. Both countries see themselves, I think, as significant maritime powers in the Indian Ocean and are very concerned about growing a growing Chinese maritime presence in the Indian Ocean. And then there are relationships in Southeast Asia. I would pick out three: Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam. These are countries with which Australia has been developing its strategic relations for some time. They're not as significant, I would say, for two reasons. Firstly, they're not as significant powers as Japan and India are. And they are much more strategically ambiguous in relation to the growing geopolitical rivalry. But I would say that the Quad is certainly front and centre in Australian strategic thinking, and to a lesser extent, those three relationships in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. It's amazing how much sort of commonality there is. You're all describing various forms of why the logic of the Quad makes sense from the respective countries or capitals that we've asked you to talk about today. And similarly, that there remains a strong need for a US role within the region. I'm struck by the similarity of some of the extra regional partners that you're describing collectively. I'm also curious, and I want to ask this question of all four of you, but not limit you to how you're responding. And I'm channeling a few questions that have come in from the chat. Thinking about the logic that's driving the countries we've been talking about together to cooperate and try and shape the regional security environment, and to do that hand in hand with the United States. It seems to me that there are at least a number of regions within the Indo-Pacific where that competition plays out. And I'm thinking specifically in the Indian Ocean region. So, Jack, it's some of the smaller countries around India's periphery, including especially the island nations in the Indian Ocean. A couple of you mentioned Vietnam as a sort of key partner. But ASEAN's also kind of a zone of contestation. I mean, it's tried to survive for decades to hold large extra-regional powers away from Southeast Asia. I'm curious, and I'm not sure I believe that it's got the ability to continue to do that in the face of US-China competition. So I'm curious for various perspectives on how you see the competition playing out within the ASEAN region. And then the third sort of geographical area would be one that seems to me to be getting more attention from outside the region, and that's the Pacific Islands. We're seeing a lot more Chinese efforts to increase influence in that region. Strong Japanese aid to various countries in that region. Australia and New Zealand both feeling like they've had a strong role in sort of driving efforts in that region. And certainly, as I look at the mood in Washington, D.C., an increased desire for the United States to get back into the Pacific Island countries. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you, but then open this up to whoever wants to jump in. But if you look at those three areas, those geographic areas within the Indo-Pacific, how do you see the US-China competition playing out in any number of those, and specifically, Australia, India, Japan, Taiwan? How do you see those countries trying to intervene and shape that competition in those regions?
Thanks, Michael. Look, I think it's a really interesting set of contrasts. If I can go back to my my sort of framing of the logic of polarization, I think you can see different countries and different regions with different options and different responses to the logic of polarization. If I go to South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, I think that you see a very wide variety of responses to the logic of polarization. On the one hand, you've got a country like Pakistan, which for obvious reasons has chosen to side very much with the China side of things, particularly as the United States has increasingly leaned away from Pakistan and towards India in its own strategic partnerships, whereas other countries, and I would put in the most significant here as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, seem to be very much playing both sides of the fence, if you like, receiving what benefits they can from China, while also maintaining positive relations with India and to a lesser extent with the United States. If I can go quickly to Southeast Asia, I think this is the region of the world where the intense desire to maintain or to resist the logic of polarization is longest and most deeply manifest. Even countries with what you might call the deepest strategic partnerships with the United States, and here I would pick out treaty allies such as the Philippines and Thailand, but also Singapore, which is not a treaty ally. While they have, to greater or lesser extents, maintained their strategic relations with the United States, with some, ups and downs in relation to Thailand and the Philippines, they very much wanted to preserve their ties with China. China is the resident power in the region. That is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It makes them want to accommodate China, but also to offset China, if you like, with relationships with the United States. Very quickly to the South Pacific. The South Pacific sees geopolitical competition between the United States and its allies and China as an unmitigated good thing. It has brought unprecedented attention to the small island states of the South Pacific. It has provided them with not only money and infrastructure, but opportunities and attention. It has allowed them to exercise much greater agency on the world stage, particularly on issues such as climate change. And so I think that they are very much on the side of resisting any polarity whatsoever, any geopolitical agendas, and really sitting back and reaping all they can gain from the growing competition. I have advocated that Australia, New Zealand, and the United States should be engaged closely in the South Pacific, but their engagement should manifestly not be about competition with China. China is there to stay. It will be a significant power in the Pacific, but China is not poised anytime soon to become the dominant player in the South Pacific. It has significant soft power challenges in the South Pacific, which I won't dwell on. And Australia and New Zealand in particular, being the resident powers, have very considerable advantages there. So that's how I see geopolitical competition playing out in those three sub-regions, Michael.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. I want to stick on that theme of the competition in the Pacific Island states and ASEAN. Tiffany, can we have you up next on that same set of questions?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think competition between China and Taiwan in at least the Pacific Islands, I think it's really escalated because previously we've seen some of Taiwan's diplomatic allies be part of this this diplomatic fight between China and Taiwan, where China is essentially trying to pull diplomatic allies away from Taiwan. And, we went through a period where there was sort of a freeze of that, and then we kind of see it restarting again in more recent years. So, we've gone from a dispute over, or competition, I think, over diplomatic allies to using things like COVID diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy. And that's something that we've seen play out in the Pacific. Japan has also been involved in the Pacific, trying to get vaccines to vulnerable Pacific Island countries, which China have been trying to cultivate. So, I think we're really seeing that that sense of competition going from just the diplomatic to the public health, really. And, China's use of vaccine diplomacy creates competition, not just against Taiwan, but also against the United States and other like-minded countries. And that's one of the things that has sort of come to to attention during the COVID-19 pandemic, where China is providing its vaccines both through favorable commercial sales and to donations in various parts of the world, including the really underserved parts of Africa and in Latin America. So, for example, I just sort of taking a step back from the Asia region, the Honduras government has also been approached by the China, and Paraguay have been approached by China, and that's really been a tool that China has been using to try and gain influence and try to establish its footprint in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Yuka, let's go to you next and then to Jack. Yuka, you're muted.
I think I'll just add what Japan has recently been focusing in the competition that the previous speaker has mentioned. I think Japan's recently been pushing on the competition and the digital infrastructure. I mean, historically, I mean, Japan has been competing with China in I mean, they're not competing, but that, they are kind of countering China's increasing countering China's BRI through its quality infrastructure partnerships. But what we've been seeing, for instance, the recent example would be the investments in infrastructure financing in undersea cables, like in Palau. It's in a way indirectly, I think, supporting, because Palau is Taiwan's diplomatic partner. It's a way for Japan, because it doesn't have a governmental relationship on ISARC, as a way to indirectly kind of support and also compete at the same time in the Pacific Islands. But also, other than undersea cables, Japan is also competing with China, also in India and in Southeast Asia in terms of 5G. And this was driven by Japan's kind of idea of coming up with alternative 5G technologies. When for instance, the US administration was saying, don't use Huawei, Japan was trying to promote this Open RAN, which is basically a disaggregated form of 5G with various with multiple vendors. And this is still something that's ongoing, and seems like Japan is facing challenges in terms of, Japan and the United States is facing challenges in terms of kind of convincing the countries in Southeast Asia. But it seems like India is becoming an important partner for 5G and IoT cooperation for Japan. So this digital dimension, I think, is where Japan is increasingly focusing on.
Thank you very much. Jack, we'll come to you to finish up here.
Great. It's a good way to come around, circle around back to the Indian Ocean. And I find myself agreeing over and over again, Michael, with you, and couldn't agree more on your point about India and Australia and the importance of that relationship for those two countries. As far as zones of contestation, I also agree, because it's important to keep in mind that even the small island countries in the Indian Ocean do have agency, not to mention countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, although Bangladesh is not an island, sadly neglected despite its considerable progress in recent years, and the fact that it has a population, oh, by the way, twice the size of Iran's. These countries have been actually very adept at playing and appealing to multiple outsiders. Interesting that China has, their ambassador in Dhaka in Bangladesh has very recently taken what can easily be described as rather a bullying stance, which I'm sure he did not do on his own, so that may cause some reassessment in Dhaka. But these have primarily been areas of Sino-Indian contestation or competition. But they all represent areas with great potential for the United States and for the other members of the Quad, or the Quad as an institution, if we can call it an institution at this stage of the game, to cooperate and provide capacity building and other assistance to these countries that could be ways so we can overlap with each other, but rather support one another in the things that we do with them, and to provide, as one of our colleagues was saying, alternatives to big bucks Chinese intervention with infrastructure and other projects, ways that we can all collaborate to supply these countries with kind of economic and social support that, as well as security support that they require. So it's an area of great opportunity, I think, all across the Indian Ocean, and to include Bangladesh, very heavily Sino-Indian, but now has lots of other opportunities for all of us as on bilateral or in a multilateral basis.
Thanks, Jack. We could keep going, but unfortunately we've reached time, and it's certainly very late now in the UK. So I'd like to thank all four panelists, Michael Wesley, Tiffany Ma, Yuka Koshino, and Jack Gill, for this great second part of the discussion. And he's no longer with us, but my colleague Ashley Tellis for his remarks at the beginning of today's session. Thank all of you for watching today. The video from this discussion will be hosted on NBR's website within a day or two. My colleagues Audrey Mossberger and Olivia Truesdale behind the scenes have done fantastic work, as always, to make this kind of an event possible. And you can see all the Strategic Asia work that NBR has put out on our website at www.nbr.org. And again, a plug that the forthcoming book in the series will be published in January of 2022, and we will look forward to discussing that with you at some future date. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.